The forest had always carried with it an air of quiet unease. The towering trees pressed close together, their branches knitting overhead like ancient guardians keeping secrets from the world outside. When the wind passed through them, it did not whistle but whispered, carrying fragments of sounds that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand upright. It was in this place, one overcast autumn afternoon, that a group of weekend hikers stumbled upon something they were never meant to find. They had been following a narrow trail that wound deeper into the woods than most dared to go. The path grew thinner, swallowed by undergrowth, and soon their boots were crunching through leaves that had lain undisturbed for decades. The air was damp and heavy, every breath tinged with the faint musk of rotting wood and wet soil. One of them, a young man with a camera slung around his neck, pointed out what looked like a circle of stones ahead. The group, curious, left the trail and stepped carefully into a small clearing. At its center, half hidden by ivy and moss, was a structure that looked almost out of place. A ring of crumbling stone, weathered by time, descending into darkness. It was, unmistakably, a well. Its lip was fractured in places, the mortar eaten away by the years, yet the shape remained intact, as though it had been waiting patiently in silence for someone to notice it again. At first, the hikers treated it like a curiosity, a forgotten relic of some old settlement. They peered over the edge cautiously, shining a flashlight into its depths. The beam of light caught on something glimmering below, and for a fleeting moment, one of them joked that perhaps the villagers once tossed coins in here, like a wishing well. But as the flashlight beam steadied, the shimmer looked wrong. The objects catching the light were pale, not metallic. Jagged, not round. One of the hikers, unable to resist, tied a rope around his waist and lowered himself a few feet down, just enough to reach the edge of the debris inside. His hand trembled as he picked up one of the strange objects. He brought it back up into the light. It was not a coin. It was a tooth. A human tooth, with the root still intact, its enamel yellowed by age but unmistakably real. The group fell silent, staring at it in disbelief. Nervous laughter escaped one of them, a defense against the growing dread. Maybe it was an animal's tooth, they suggested. Maybe it had just been dropped there by chance. But as they shone their lights deeper into the well, the truth revealed itself. The bottom of the structure was not filled with coins. It was filled with teeth. Thousands of them, spilling over one another like pebbles on a riverbed. Small teeth. Large teeth. Molars, canines, incisors. Some old, cracked, and brown with age, others disturbingly fresh, as if only recently torn from someone's mouth. The sight was grotesque, a mosaic of human remains arranged in the most unnatural way. Panic rose quickly. The hikers stumbled back from the edge, their breathing ragged, their laughter gone. One of them fumbled for a phone, hands shaking, and called the authorities. Their voices were hushed now, their eyes darting nervously toward the darkened trees, as though something unseen might be watching. The well no longer felt like a forgotten relic. It felt alive, like a mouth that had been feeding for decades. When the authorities arrived, they wasted no time roping off the clearing. Yellow tape went up between the trees, fluttering faintly in the breeze. Officers leaned over the edge, their expressions hardening as they confirmed what the hikers had seen. Forensic teams began their slow, meticulous descent into the depths of the well, scooping and cataloging the remains with gloved hands. Each tooth was bagged, labeled, and carried away, but the pile seemed endless, replenishing itself no matter how much they took. The forest, once indifferent, now felt hostile. The silence was heavy, as though the woods themselves were complicit in the discovery, unwilling to surrender their secret. The local sheriff, a man who had lived his whole life in the nearby town, was overheard muttering that he had never seen anything like it, not in training, not in all his years on the force. His voice carried an edge of fear he couldn't quite hide. Reporters arrived by evening, their vans lining the narrow dirt road leading to the trailhead. The air buzzed with speculation. Was it the burial site of an unknown killer? Some long-forgotten ritual? Or something stranger still, something that defied explanation. Cameras flashed as officials tried to push the media back, but the story had already escaped the forest. Whispers spread quickly through the town. The old well had been found again, and it was filled not with wishes, but with something far darker. And yet, even as the world began to ask questions, no one could provide answers. Who had placed the teeth there? Why had no one noticed before? And most disturbingly of all, how recent were some of those remains? The well had opened its mouth and shown what it had swallowed, but it had not explained its hunger. By nightfall, as the last of the hikers gave their statements and the clearing grew quiet again, the unease only deepened. The investigators knew they had uncovered something that went far beyond what they had prepared for. The teeth were not just evidence. They were a message. A message waiting to be decoded. But by whom? And at what cost? The morning after the discovery, the town was already buzzing with unease. News of the well had spread from porch to porch, whispered over coffee cups and murmured in the aisles of the small local grocery store. Everyone knew the woods were strange. They had always carried with them a reputation that balanced uneasily between myth and reality. But now, with the revelation of the teeth, the whispers turned to something darker. They were no longer just stories meant to keep children from wandering too far into the trees, they were warnings, half forgotten, resurfacing with new weight. The woods, people said, had always been hungry. That was the word that seemed to stick. Long before hikers came with their flashlights and cameras, children had been told to never stray beyond the old stone markers that lined the path. These markers, some crumbling and moss-covered, had no inscriptions. They stood like silent sentinels, as though placed there not to guide but to warn. Parents would whisper to their sons and daughters, "Stay away from the grove. Don't go near the old stones." And if the children asked why, they were told the same chilling refrain, "Because that's where the well waits." Few could recall who first started telling the stories. Some said they were inherited from settlers who had once tried to clear the land but left in haste, abandoning farms and cabins that quickly fell to ruin. Others believed the legends were older still, carried by indigenous tribes who had once avoided that patch of land with the same fearful respect. According to one fragment of oral tradition, the well was not built but summoned, a wound in the earth where people once made offerings in exchange for blessings, but blessings always came at a cost. An elderly man named Harold Mason was one of the first to speak to reporters. He was a recluse, living on the edge of town in a sagging wooden house nearly swallowed by weeds, but when the discovery made headlines, he stepped forward, his voice low and quivering with age. "My granddaddy told me about the well," he said. "Said folks used to throw things into it, back when he was a boy. Not coins. Never coins. They gave pieces of themselves. Nails, hair, teeth." He leaned in closer, his cloudy eyes glinting as he whispered, "And if you didn't give it, it would take." Others in town had their own variations. A retired schoolteacher recalled her grandmother refusing to let her play near the forest edge, warning her that the well collected wishes, but only the kind you regretted making. A farmer's widow swore she once saw shadows moving between the trees on a moonless night, figures she swore were not human but shaped like them. They were carrying something, she murmured, and heading toward the grove. Her voice cracked as she said it, as though she had been holding the memory back for decades. The stories began to paint a picture of a place that had always been more than just wilderness. The forest was alive in its silence, a container of memories, grief, and fear. To some, the discovery of the teeth was not a surprise at all. It was proof of what they had known all along, that the well was no mere ruin, but something that demanded, something that consumed. Reporters ate up the folklore, writing sensational headlines about a cursed well and the forest that feeds. But when pressed for specifics, the townsfolk grew evasive. They would share fragments, half-stories, but stopped short of saying too much, as though the very act of speaking could draw the well's attention. Some refused to comment entirely, crossing themselves or muttering prayers when asked. A superstition seemed to cling to the air, heavy and unshakable, as though dredging up the past would only invite it back. One evening, a small group of journalists sat in the corner of the town's only bar, coaxing stories from locals with free drinks. After several rounds, an old woman finally leaned forward and whispered, "You think it's strange to find teeth in a well? That's nothing. Once, when I was a girl, my uncle told me he saw bones scattered around it. Not just teeth. Whole bones. But by morning, they were gone. Like the earth had swallowed them." Her words sent shivers across the table, the clink of glasses falling silent for a moment too long. The lore deepened further when someone mentioned a phrase that had circulated quietly for years, "the well that takes wishing." It was said that if you stood at the edge and whispered your deepest desire, something in the darkness would hear you. If it found your wish worthy, it would give you what you asked for, but it always demanded a price. Sometimes, it was something you could offer willingly, a tooth, a lock of hair, even a drop of blood. But if you tried to cheat it, if you dared to ask without giving, the well would come to collect. The image was horrifying, yet captivating. Reporters scribbled every word, hungry for the macabre details. The townsfolk, however, were less excited. Their eyes darted toward the door, their voices hushed to murmurs. Even in the safety of the bar, surrounded by people, they seemed certain that talking too much about the well was dangerous. The sheriff himself tried to downplay the stories, insisting that folklore and myth had no bearing on the investigation. But even he could not erase the tension in his voice when pressed. "I've heard the stories same as anyone else," he admitted quietly to one journalist. "Heard them my whole life. But stories don't explain what's sitting at the bottom of that well right now. Stories don't explain the teeth." As night fell over the town, the whispers grew heavier. Families locked their doors earlier than usual. Curtains were drawn tight. Somewhere, in the forest, the well sat waiting, its silent mouth open to the night. And in the quiet, an old villager was heard to mutter just loud enough for someone nearby to catch, "The well never gave wishes, it only took them." The words lingered in the air long after he left, a chill settling into the bones of everyone who heard them. The forensic team worked slowly, methodically, their boots crunching against the soil as they descended into the clearing once again. By now the well had become less a discovery and more a crime scene, a place where science would have to speak louder than superstition. But as the days passed, the line between the two seemed to blur. The sheer volume of teeth was staggering, almost incomprehensible. Thousands upon thousands, piled together, as though the well had been fed for generations. Each tooth was carefully lifted, bagged, and catalogued. Technicians crouched over trays, brushing away dirt and moss. They counted, labeled, and organized until their hands ached, but the pile seemed endless. The well was deep, and every time a layer of teeth was removed, another gleamed faintly beneath it. It was like excavating a graveyard with no bodies, only fragments of lives reduced to enamel and bone. Forensic experts began analyzing the collection, searching for patterns. At first, they believed they were dealing with a macabre collection of relics, perhaps offerings from a forgotten cultural practice. Teeth have long been symbols of vitality, identity, and sacrifice. In many traditions, they are associated with luck or protection. But the evidence quickly revealed something much darker. The teeth were not uniform. Some belonged to adults, their surfaces worn down by decades of chewing. Others were unmistakably children's teeth, still small, delicate, with roots not yet fully formed. A chilling number were milk teeth, the kind parents might keep as keepsakes, slipped under pillows for the tooth fairy. Only here, they weren't tucked away in boxes or books. They had been cast into darkness, swallowed by the well. Laboratory analysis revealed something else, the age of the teeth spanned generations. Some were ancient, brittle with decay, dating back at least 50 or 60 years. Others, disturbingly, were far more recent. Forensic testing suggested some teeth had been deposited within the last decade, maybe even within the last few years. The well was not just a relic of history, it was active. Someone had continued to feed it. The implications were horrifying. The investigators sat around long tables in dimly lit rooms, the teeth spread out before them in sterile trays. Questions spilled over one another. Who had been placing these teeth in the well? Were they trophies, collected by a killer or killers? Ritual offerings from some hidden group? Or could the stories the townspeople whispered, about a well that demanded sacrifices, contain some truth after all? As the team worked, they began to notice certain patterns. Some teeth bore signs of trauma, roots broken in ways that suggested they had not fallen out naturally but were forcibly removed. Others carried drill marks, as though they had been extracted in a crude, painful manner. Several were stained unnaturally, discolored by substances that forensic chemists could not immediately identify. It was not just a collection. It was evidence of violence. Then came the discovery that unsettled even the most hardened of the investigators. Among the teeth, lodged in a crevice of stone within the well, they found fragments of wood. When analyzed, the wood showed strange indentations, markings that forensic odontologists quickly recognized as bite marks. Human bite marks. The pattern matched the shape of incisors and molars, pressed deeply into the surface. Someone had bitten into the wood so hard it splintered. The revelation was chilling. It suggested that the well had not simply been a passive receptacle for teeth, it had been the site of something active, something desperate. Were people forced to throw their teeth in? Or worse, had they been compelled to pull them out themselves? The bite marks told a story of pain, of frantic resistance, of something unspeakable happening at the edge of that dark stone ring. The lead forensic examiner, a woman who had worked countless cases of violence and mass graves, confessed later in an interview that the well disturbed her more than anything else she had ever seen. "You can read bones like books," she said softly, her hands trembling slightly as she turned a tooth over in her palm. "But these teeth, they're screaming. They're telling us something terrible happened here. It's just that none of us can fully understand the language." As the investigation deepened, tension mounted in the town. Rumors spread like wildfire, growing with each retelling. Some whispered that the well had been a site of torture, a hidden chamber where victims were mutilated before being discarded. Others insisted it was part of a ritual, that the cult stories weren't mere superstition but fact. The imagery of thousands of teeth, extracted and offered, was too visceral to ignore. Parents clutched their children closer. Farmers double-locked their barns. And every night, the well sat in the woods, silent and patient, as though mocking the investigators who tried to strip it of its secrets. The press hounded the authorities for answers, but none were forthcoming. Officials gave carefully worded statements about ongoing forensic analysis and possible historical origins, but behind closed doors, even they were shaken. The sheriff reportedly walked out of one of the forensic briefings pale as a ghost, refusing to speak for hours afterward. One particularly grim discovery only deepened the unease. Hidden among the teeth was a small silver locket, tarnished and rusted but intact. Inside was a photograph, a young girl, smiling shyly, her front teeth missing in the way of children growing into adolescence. No one knew her name. No one recognized the face. But the locket was placed carefully on the table, staring back at the investigators like a ghost caught in silver. The presence of the locket suggested intent, a personal connection, perhaps even a message. Whoever placed it there wanted it to be found. Theories collided. Some believed the well was a dumping ground for medical waste, teeth pulled from patients and discarded by unscrupulous dentists in some bygone era. But that theory crumbled when the evidence of trauma and bite marks came to light. Others suggested it was the work of a serial killer spanning decades, someone who took trophies and deposited them in the forest. That, too, felt incomplete, given the sheer scale and variety of the collection. And then there were those who did not shy away from the darker possibilities. The cult. The whispers of rituals in the trees. Teeth as symbols of identity, life, and power. If the stories were true, then the well was not just a hiding place. It was an altar. The forensic evidence, the bite marks, the locket, they all seemed to point in the same direction, even if no one wanted to admit it aloud. Someone had been feeding the well, and they had done so deliberately, purposefully, for decades. Whether as part of ritual, madness, or something else entirely, the conclusion was inescapable: this was no accident of history. It was ongoing. And yet, the most haunting detail was not the thousands of teeth already uncovered. It was the freshness of some of them, the undeniable proof that whoever, or whatever, was responsible had not stopped. The well was still being fed. As the lead investigator closed his notebook late one evening, staring at the endless trays of enamel, he whispered the thought no one wanted to hear but everyone feared was true: this isn't just evidence of the past. This is evidence of the present. As forensic teams continued their painstaking work, investigators turned their attention to the town's records, hoping to trace the origins of the teeth and the well itself. What they found sent chills down their spines. Decades of disappearances had occurred in the area, cases that had been filed and then quietly closed, marked unsolved or no leads. The files were brittle with age, the ink faded, but the names and ages of the missing were unmistakable. A pattern began to emerge, one that suggested the well had claimed its first victims long before the hikers' discovery. The earliest documented cases went back to the 1940s. Children had vanished while playing near the edge of the forest or walking home from school, sometimes just blocks from their homes. In some files, investigators noted that search parties had combed the woods for days, yet no trace was ever found. Families were left in the impossible space of hope and grief, letters to the police unanswered, leads exhausted. Over time, the cases faded from headlines, and the forest returned to its quiet, brooding presence, hiding its secrets beneath the canopy. As the decades progressed, the disappearances became more frequent, though still sporadic enough to avoid widespread panic. In the 1960s and 70s, teenagers walking at night reported seeing shadows moving between the trees, glimpses of figures that disappeared as quickly as they were noticed. Some described hearing whispers, soft voices calling names they didn't recognize, but compelling enough to make them freeze in place. The descriptions were eerily consistent: the figures were hooded, moving with a deliberate, almost ceremonial precision, and the forest around them seemed unnaturally silent, as if holding its breath. Victims' families shared their stories with the investigators, recounting evenings spent searching the woods, calling names into the darkness, only to return home empty-handed. Letters, diaries, and photographs were collected, each piece painting a fragment of a life interrupted. One mother described her son's last night vividly: he had insisted on taking a shortcut through the woods on his way home from a friend's house. She had begged him not to, repeating the warnings she had heard since childhood about the grove. Yet he laughed, reassured her with a grin, and disappeared into the shadows. No one ever saw him again. The police records, however, told an unsettling story of bureaucratic silence. Many of the early cases were closed without explanation, classified as runaways or misadventures, despite the young ages of the missing and the suspicious proximity to the forest. Some officers' notes hinted at rumors that the well had always been dangerous, but these warnings were buried, dismissed as superstition. One detective, nearing retirement, confided quietly to the current team that he had once been ordered to stop investigating a case when he drew too close to the forest. Some things, he said, shaking his head, the town wanted to stay buried. A particularly grim case file contained the details of a child named Emily, who disappeared in the early 1950s. She had been last seen wearing a red coat, skipping along the path near the forest's edge, carrying a small tin box that she had filled with coins to toss into the well, or so she had said. Her mother found her tin box abandoned on the trail the next morning, its contents missing. In the margin of the police report, an officer had written, "The well is still waiting." No one understood the meaning at the time. As the investigators compared old reports to modern forensic findings, the connection became undeniable. Teeth recovered from the well corresponded in age and type to some of the missing children, though most were too degraded to be individually identified. Still, the pattern was clear: the well had been collecting for decades, carefully, deliberately, and with a consistency that suggested planning rather than random chance. The emotional weight of these discoveries was overwhelming. Meeting with the descendants of victims, the investigators saw faces etched with decades of sorrow. Parents who had lost children long ago, now elderly, recounted memories in shaky voices, alternating between anger and despair. Some held photographs close to their chests, whispering names no one else remembered. Others wept openly, rage and grief mingling in a torrent that the forensic evidence could not contain. These were not just teeth in a well, these were lives erased, stories interrupted, families shattered. In piecing together the history, investigators also noted anomalies in the timeline. Some disappearances coincided with odd events in the town, unexplained fires in abandoned homes, livestock found mutilated near the forest edge, strange symbols scratched into trees. Locals recalled hearing chanting late at night, though no one dared venture close enough to confirm. While some dismissed these as embellishments, the investigators could not ignore the consistency with which they appeared across decades. Even more disturbing were the cases that spanned generations. In the 1970s, a teenager named Robert vanished on a dare from his friends. He had claimed he wanted to prove the well was a myth, that there was nothing sinister about it. His friends later admitted to hearing strange noises, whispers that seemed to echo from the ground itself, drawing them back toward the well. They ran, terrified, leaving Robert behind. His remains were never found, though the age and type of some teeth later recovered from the well suggested a connection. The town's dark history, meticulously buried in police files and whispered tales, was now being unearthed alongside the physical evidence. The investigators began to understand that the well was more than a curiosity, more than a relic of folklore. It was the epicenter of decades of disappearances, a constant in a changing landscape, and a symbol of the town's unwillingness to confront the horrors hiding in plain sight. As they compiled the data, a clear but horrifying picture emerged. The well had been active long before anyone could remember, its influence stretching across generations. As the investigation deepened, it became painfully clear that the town itself harbored shadows darker than the forest. The well, with its grotesque collection of teeth, was not merely an isolated horror. It was part of a history that many had been complicit in hiding. Records were missing, files had been shredded or misfiled, and key witnesses had disappeared or refused to speak. Every lead that investigators pursued seemed to run up against an invisible wall, a collective resistance born of fear, tradition, and a desire to keep the past buried. The first clues emerged in the town archives. Letters from decades past hinted at tensions between officials and locals over the forest. Reports of missing children were often marked with euphemisms, wandered off, lost to circumstance, or under care of authorities. In some cases, local sheriffs had actively discouraged searches, citing the danger of the forest or the futility of combing its depths. The language was clinical, but the undertone was chilling. Someone, somewhere, had wanted the disappearances to stop being investigated. Interviews with longtime residents painted an even more disturbing picture. Many admitted to knowing about the well for years, though few dared mention it openly. "We didn't talk about it," said a retired schoolteacher. "It was easier to pretend it didn't exist. Easier than admitting that people you trusted, people in the town, were involved." Another resident, a former town council member, admitted to ignoring complaints about the forest. "There was fear, yes," he said. "But there was also power. People with influence wanted the stories to stay quiet. They didn't care about the teeth, or the children, or anyone else." The investigators began piecing together a disturbing pattern. Families who had pushed too hard for answers often found themselves ostracized or pressured to leave town. Several former officials, now elderly and in poor health, hinted at a network of individuals who had deliberately silenced investigations. Their motivations were murky, some cited superstition, others feared legal repercussions, and a few seemed motivated by something darker, perhaps knowledge of rituals or practices connected to the well. Local folklore, once dismissed as harmless storytelling, began to take on new weight. Tales of figures in the woods, strange gatherings, and whispered chants were not merely the product of imagination. Patterns emerged linking the folklore to actual events, children disappearing, items left near the well, and signs of ritualistic behavior. It became increasingly clear that the well was more than a passive repository, it was part of a system maintained by the town itself, a mechanism for secrecy and control. One former police officer, now living in seclusion, recounted an incident from the late 1970s. He had been called to investigate a missing girl near the forest edge, only to be warned off by his superiors. They said it was best not to dig too deep, he recalled, voice low. They didn't mean the forest. They meant the people in town. There were things happening that weren't meant to be discovered. When pressed, he refused to elaborate, his eyes darting nervously toward the shadows of the room. It was as if the mere act of speaking might summon consequences long thought dormant. As the investigators delved further, they discovered that several town officials over the decades had personal connections to the well. Some had owned property near the forest, others had lost relatives under mysterious circumstances, and a few had direct ties to groups rumored to conduct rituals in the woods. Meetings once thought routine, town hall discussions and local committee gatherings, now appeared to have been designed to maintain secrecy. Notes in some records hinted at decisions made to protect individuals rather than uphold justice. The deeper the investigation went, the more apparent it became that fear had been the town's currency. Families were discouraged from asking questions, teachers were instructed not to discuss the well with students, and law enforcement was complicit in maintaining silence. Residents spoke of a collective, almost unspoken agreement: the forest, the well, and the disappearances were things to be ignored, to be pushed into the shadows where no one would look too closely. Yet there were moments of quiet defiance. A few brave locals, aware of the ongoing horror, had attempted to document incidents over the years, keeping journals, photographs, and notes. Some had been threatened or coerced into silence. Others vanished entirely, their absence attributed to misfortune or relocation. The pattern suggested that knowledge itself carried danger, and that those who tried to uncover the truth risked becoming part of the story they sought to expose. Investigators also discovered that some of the older buildings in town held hidden evidence. Abandoned barns and sheds contained remnants of rituals, burned incense, small collections of teeth, and faint symbols scratched into wood. Though incomplete, these traces reinforced the theory that the well was not just a singular site but part of a network of practices maintained over decades. It was a system of secrecy, ritual, and fear, one that the town had tacitly endorsed, either through belief, ignorance, or self-preservation. Even local businesses played a role, knowingly or unknowingly. Grocery stores that sold tooth-related charms, pharmacies that reported missing inventory, and contractors who worked on forested properties all contributed to the ecosystem of secrecy. While no single establishment could be blamed entirely, the pattern was undeniable: the town's economy, culture, and governance had evolved in a way that allowed the well's horrors to persist. The most unsettling discovery came when the investigators found correspondence between town leaders and external parties. Letters and telegrams from decades past suggested an understanding, perhaps even coordination, with groups outside the town who were aware of the forest's dark significance. The content was cryptic but hinted at arrangements that prioritized silence over justice. Whoever orchestrated this had influence reaching far beyond the local sheriff's office, ensuring that the well and its offerings remained untouched by law or scrutiny. The cumulative weight of these revelations left investigators shaken. The town they had entered as outsiders, expecting folklore and superstition, was instead a living network of complicity. The teeth in the well were not merely the result of random acts of violence, they were the product of a system designed to hide, protect, and perpetuate a centuries-old secret. The forest, the well, and the disappearances were intertwined with the town's identity, bound together by fear, loyalty, and silence. And as the sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows across the town streets, investigators realized something terrifying: uncovering the well's secrets was not just about documenting the past. It was about challenging the very fabric of a community that had, for generations, chosen darkness over truth. Somewhere in the shadows, someone was watching, waiting, ensuring that the teeth continued to fall into the well. The forest had its guardians, and the town, it seemed, was complicit in their keeping. The investigators knew that the path ahead would be perilous. The truth was buried not only in the soil of the forest but in the hearts and minds of the people who had lived beside it for decades. And if the town's darkest secret had been protected this long, what else might they uncover, and what price would they pay for the answers? The further the investigation went, the more it became clear that the well was more than a site of macabre curiosity or town complicity. Whispers of organized, ritualistic activity began to emerge, hints that a secretive group had used the forest, and the well, for purposes far beyond superstition. Survivors' testimonies, old police notes, and scattered local legends all began to point toward a cult, a clandestine society operating in the shadows, feeding the forest's dark appetite. The first concrete evidence came from interviews with townspeople who had grown up near the woods but left decades ago. Many spoke of hooded figures seen in the forest at night, moving in patterns that were too deliberate to be coincidental. Sometimes the witnesses claimed to hear chanting, low, rhythmic, and unnerving. Some described seeing fires ringed by stones, strange symbols carved into tree trunks, and offerings placed carefully on the ground. The consistency of these accounts, stretching across generations, was impossible to ignore. Historical records offered corroboration. In police files from the 1960s, there were reports of missing persons whose disappearances coincided with rumors of ritual gatherings in the forest. Notes mentioned sightings of groups performing what was described as ceremonial acts, often near the same area where the well now drew attention. Officers at the time dismissed these as hallucinations or folklore, but investigators in the present day could not reconcile the sheer volume and detail of these records with ordinary superstition. Something deliberate, organized, and enduring was happening in those woods. Local folklore suddenly took on a new meaning. Stories once dismissed as childish warnings about the forest now revealed symbolic patterns. Children were warned to never enter the grove at night. Older generations spoke of offerings made to the trees and the well, each with precise instructions: a tooth for life, a lock of hair for protection, a drop of blood for favor. The investigators began to see a disturbing logic in what had previously seemed random. The teeth in the well were not scattered carelessly. They were placed with intention, a ritual repeated over decades, each layer carefully added to the growing mound below. Forensic analysis reinforced this theory. Many teeth bore signs of ritualistic handling, cleaned, sometimes polished, sometimes marked with faint symbols using rudimentary tools. The fresh teeth indicated that this practice had not died out, it persisted, a thread connecting the past to the present. The act of depositing a tooth was not merely symbolic but deeply personal, a forced participation that tied the victim directly to the cult's objectives. Whoever orchestrated this had refined their methods over decades, ensuring continuity while remaining hidden in plain sight. Survivors' accounts added further layers of horror. A woman, now middle-aged, recounted her experience as a child when she had accidentally wandered too close to the grove. She described hooded figures surrounding her, whispering instructions, their voices both alluring and terrifying. They demanded a contribution for her passage, and though she had fled without complying, the memory haunted her for years. Others spoke of being coerced into minor rituals, performing small tasks in the forest, only to return home shaken and silent. The common thread was fear, obedience, and the impression that refusal would result in consequences far worse than simple reprimand. Investigators began to see that the cult operated with layers of secrecy. They were not simply people drawn to folklore or the supernatural, they were organized, disciplined, and careful. Their activity was hidden in plain sight. Annual town festivals, community events, and even local business transactions may have provided cover for gatherings, the well serving as the epicenter of their operations. The teeth, then, were both offerings and markers, a tangible proof of participation, evidence of the cult's reach and influence. Physical evidence from the forest suggested that the well was not the only location of significance. Scattered around the trees were symbols carved into bark, some resembling ancient sigils, others abstract but consistent in design. Small fire pits, remnants of rituals long extinguished, were arranged in geometrical patterns. Some artifacts, partially decayed, hinted at ceremonial use of human remains or symbolic items. The forest itself had become a stage, meticulously arranged over decades, where the cult enacted its rites without interference. Historical parallels emerged as well. Researchers noted that similar groups in other regions had used teeth, hair, and other personal items in rituals as tokens of power, submission, or protection. The teeth in the well could serve multiple purposes: offerings to appease some unseen force, a method of binding individuals to the cult, or a symbol of control over life and death. This perspective offered a chilling explanation for why the well had persisted for generations. It was not only about fear or superstition, it was about maintaining power through ritualized secrecy. Interviews with retired law enforcement officers revealed that some had suspected the existence of a cult but were discouraged from pursuing it. While decades of disappearances and the cult's history painted a chilling backdrop, the investigators' most urgent concern quickly became the present. Fresh teeth in the well were proof that its dark activity had not ceased. This was no historical relic, it was a living horror, one that demanded immediate attention. The question that haunted everyone was clear: who was responsible now, and how could they be stopped before more lives were claimed? Forensic teams returned to the well with renewed urgency. Each fresh tooth was meticulously examined, analyzed for DNA, age, and origin. The results were shocking. Some belonged to children who had gone missing in the last few years, cases that had not previously been connected to the forest. Others were from young adults, people whose disappearances had been dismissed as voluntary absences or unreported entirely. The pattern was unmistakable. The well was still being fed, and the reach of whoever was responsible was wider than anyone had imagined. The investigators began canvassing the town again, this time focusing on residents with recent ties to the forest. They interviewed hikers, campers, hunters, and anyone who had been near the grove in the past decade. Most claimed ignorance, but subtle inconsistencies began to emerge in testimonies. Some admitted to seeing strange figures late at night, while others reported items left near the well, which seemed to vanish overnight. These seemingly minor details began to coalesce into a disturbing picture of ongoing activity. Technological tools provided additional evidence. Motion-activated cameras set around the forest's perimeter captured blurry figures moving at odd hours, some with hoods or masks obscuring their faces. The images were grainy but enough to indicate organized movement. Trails that were once thought and used were active, with signs of recent foot traffic, makeshift shelters, and small fires that had been extinguished quickly. It was clear, someone or a group of people was still operating in the forest, maintaining rituals that had persisted for generations. Investigators also began analyzing the teeth for trace evidence. Some showed residues of substances that had no immediate explanation: powders, plant matter, and faint chemical traces suggesting some form of preparation before deposition. Bite marks on splintered wood and tools indicated deliberate, forceful handling, implying coercion or violent participation. This evidence painted a picture of a present-day operation, one that mirrored the patterns of the past with terrifying precision. The town itself was no longer merely a repository of history, it had become a stage for ongoing activity. Recent disappearances had not been random, they were consistent with the well's pattern. Investigators cross-referenced local missing persons reports and found cases dismissed as runaways or accidents now matched characteristics of the long-standing cult practices. The sheer audacity was chilling. The cult had adapted, evolving its methods while staying hidden in plain sight. Psychological profiling became crucial. Experts examined the profiles of potential perpetrators, looking for individuals who could maintain secrecy over years and possibly decades. They considered the possibility of multigenerational participation, individuals indoctrinated from childhood into secrecy, loyalty, and fear. The pattern of teeth placement, ceremonial handling, and consistency in ritual practices suggested knowledge passed down meticulously, a living tradition rather than sporadic criminal acts. The investigators also noted the terrifying efficiency of the operation. Fresh teeth were deposited without drawing attention, no one had been caught, and no one had left the forest with evidence outside the investigators' scrutiny. Whoever was responsible had a deep understanding of the terrain, the forest's rhythm, and the town's social dynamics. They moved unseen, blending into ordinary life while orchestrating something profoundly unnatural in the shadows. One chilling discovery confirmed this. Among the recently deposited teeth, investigators found a set with evidence of extreme precision, roots carefully trimmed, surfaces cleaned, and some even engraved with faint symbols. DNA analysis indicated they belonged to multiple individuals, including minors, suggesting coercion or force. The sophistication of the work hinted at training, ritual knowledge, and the deliberate perpetuation of a practice that spanned generations. The well was not just a receptacle, it was a repository of power, control, and fear. Community members began coming forward with accounts they had long been too afraid to share. A young woman admitted to witnessing hooded figures leading someone into the forest late at night. She had initially stayed silent, fearing retaliation. An older man revealed that he had once participated in minor rituals decades ago, coerced by elders, but had since fled the practice. His confession underscored the ongoing influence the cult could exert, even on those who tried to leave. Local authorities felt the strain. They realized that intervening in the forest was not merely a matter of law enforcement but risked direct confrontation with a deeply rooted, organized, and dangerous group. Efforts to surveil the forest had to be discreet. The investigators feared tipping off the perpetrators, potentially endangering lives. Every step forward required careful planning, balancing the need for evidence with the imperative of safety. The psychological impact on the investigative team was profound. Working amid evidence of recent victims forced them to confront the reality that this horror was alive, active, and capable of claiming more. Nights became restless, thoughts haunted by the possibility of unseen observers. The forest, once a place of trees and shadows, now seemed sentient, an active participant in the perpetuation of the well's darkness. Experts from outside the town were consulted. Anthropologists, criminologists, and ritual specialists examined the evidence, offering theories about ongoing ceremonial practices, indoctrination, and psychological manipulation. They emphasized the rarity of a cult surviving undetected for decades, maintaining its operations while adapting to societal changes. The well was not an anomaly, it was the centerpiece of a network of secrecy and control, one that required vigilance, intelligence, and careful coordination to understand. As investigators cross-referenced historical disappearances with recent activity, a horrifying realization emerged: the pattern was accelerating. Recent teeth deposits coincided with times of year when missing persons were reported, suggesting the cult had predictable cycles, perhaps tied to seasonal or symbolic events. This insight provided a narrow window of potential intervention, but it also heightened the urgency. The next victims could be anyone, anywhere within the forest's reach. The investigation now faced a critical turning point. Evidence of the present confirmed that the well was not simply a relic or a historical curiosity. It was a living site of ritual, maintained with precision and secrecy. The perpetrators were not confined to the past, they were in the town, among its residents, capable of continuing their work undetected. Every discovery, from DNA to symbolic markings, reinforced the terrifying truth: the teeth in the well were not just remnants of history, they were proof of ongoing predation, and the investigators were running out of time to prevent the next chapter in the well's gruesome story. And as night fell once more over the forest, investigators could not shake the sense that the trees themselves were watching, waiting, and listening. The well remained silent at the center, patient and unyielding, as if daring them to uncover its secrets while continuing its relentless appetite. The past had returned to meet the present, and the investigators realized with a cold certainty that the well's story was far from over. As the investigation intensified, the lines between observer and participant began to blur. The forest that had long concealed its horrors now seemed to respond to intrusion, its shadows shifting and deepening around those who sought to uncover its secrets. Investigators who had once felt confident in their methodical approach began experiencing an unsettling reality: the hunters had become the hunted. Every step toward understanding the well seemed to trigger an unseen awareness, a presence that observed, adapted, and threatened. Reports of strange occurrences among the investigative team surfaced quickly. Equipment malfunctioned in inexplicable ways, cameras captured fleeting shadows that disappeared when reviewed, and compasses spun erratically near the well. Some team members reported hearing whispers in the trees, voices so faint they could almost be dismissed, until they repeated in patterns that mirrored missing persons' names or whispered commands. Fatigue and fear began to gnaw at the group, yet the presence of tangible evidence, the teeth, the locket, the ritual markings, demanded that they continue. Local informants provided cryptic warnings, urging caution and suggesting that the forest's guardians were watching. A former resident, long reluctant to speak, revealed that townspeople had once paid tribute to the well indirectly, offering items or silence in exchange for safety. They knew the forest didn't forgive mistakes, she said. And anyone who looked too closely risked joining the well themselves. Her eyes darted nervously, as though she expected someone or something to appear from the shadows. The investigators realized that they were not merely uncovering history, they had intruded into an ongoing system of control. The forest itself seemed to conspire against them. Paths they had mapped out became confusing and circular, as if the land was shifting to obscure their movements. Lights carried into the woods flickered, disappearing in moments of unnerving stillness. Small animals, usually present in predictable numbers, vanished, leaving the team feeling isolated and exposed. Each day spent near the well heightened tension, eroding their confidence and sharpening the sense that they were no longer safe. A particularly unsettling event occurred when one investigator ventured close to the well alone to photograph a fresh deposition of teeth. As she leaned over the stone rim, she heard a faint rustling behind her. Turning quickly, she saw nothing but a cluster of trees swaying unnaturally, despite no wind. Moments later, she discovered a single tooth lying on the forest floor, unlike the others, clean, polished, and freshly placed. The implication was undeniable: the forest had noticed her presence, and someone, or something, had responded directly. Interactions with townspeople became tense. Some residents, previously cooperative, grew suspicious or openly hostile. A few suggested that the investigators leave immediately, hinting at consequences that were never clearly articulated but deeply understood. Anonymous notes began appearing at the edges of campsites, warning of eyes in the trees, and advising that the well does not forgive curiosity. The warnings were chilling, and while some dismissed them as pranks, others began to feel the weight of historical precedent. Disappearances had always followed those who probed too deeply. Technology offered no sanctuary. Motion sensors, GPS trackers, and communication devices frequently failed, either malfunctioning inexplicably or yielding incomplete data. Reports of missing equipment, objects moved or altered without explanation, and recordings corrupted or erased created an atmosphere of paranoia. The investigators increasingly understood that the forest was not passive, it actively resisted documentation and observation. Every attempt to gather evidence seemed anticipated, as if the well itself had eyes. The psychological strain among the team grew palpable. Anxiety, nightmares, and hypervigilance became common. One member confessed that she dreamed of being dragged into the well, surrounded by teeth and whispers, while another began carrying a personal talisman, hoping for protection from forces he could neither see nor explain. The forest's oppressive atmosphere penetrated even moments of daylight, and the team recognized that confronting the well required not just courage, but constant vigilance. Yet the sense of being hunted extended beyond physical phenomena. Investigators began to suspect that human operatives remained active in the forest. Evidence suggested that someone was monitoring their movements, leaving fresh teeth strategically to unsettle them, moving objects or leaving symbols to communicate warnings. It became apparent that the cult, or a faction thereof, was aware of the investigation and was prepared to interfere, perhaps violently, to protect its secrets. The stakes had escalated from historical documentation to a tangible threat to life. Coordination with law enforcement outside the town was considered, but the historical precedent suggested caution. Past interventions had failed or been suppressed. The well and the forest operated within a network of complicity and fear, one that local knowledge, community loyalty, and possibly ritual authority reinforced. Interference from outsiders risked provoking the cult while endangering the investigators themselves. Every decision required balancing the pursuit of truth with personal safety. A pivotal moment occurred when a team member discovered a crude message etched into the bark near the well: "Leave, or join the collection." The words were unnerving not only for their direct threat but because they referenced the very phenomenon that had drawn the investigators' attention: the accumulation of teeth, symbolic of both life and death. The message made clear that the cult's reach extended to surveillance, psychological manipulation, and intimidation. The investigators were no longer merely observing history, they were participants in a cycle of fear that had persisted for decades. Despite the growing danger, the team continued. They knew that leaving would mean surrendering to the forest's guardians and abandoning the victims, both past and present. Detailed logs, photographs, and collected evidence became acts of defiance. Each tooth catalogued, each symbol documented, was a statement that the forest, the cult, and the well would not continue their operations unchecked. Yet every triumph was tempered by the awareness that they were being watched, studied, and perhaps baited into a trap. The sense of being hunted reached its peak one night when the team discovered footprints around the well that did not match any of their own. They were too small for most adults, irregular in pattern, and moving deliberately between trees in a manner consistent with known ritual paths. Following the tracks was impossible without risk, they seemed to vanish and reappear, guiding the observers like phantoms. The forest itself seemed complicit, the shadows folding around the footprints as if concealing a presence. By dawn, exhaustion and fear had taken hold. The deeper the investigators delved into the forest, the more they realized that the well was not the only repository of secrets. Hidden messages, subtle and cryptic, were scattered throughout the surrounding woods, carved into tree trunks, etched into rocks, and sometimes left on the forest floor. At first glance, these markings appeared random, scratches and lines that could be dismissed as natural damage or animal activity. But as patterns emerged, it became clear that someone had been leaving deliberate signs, a language of warning, ritual, or communication spanning decades. The first messages were simple: X-shaped carvings on the bark of young trees, faint symbols resembling teeth, or small piles of stones arranged in specific patterns. Forensic anthropologists and cryptographers were called in to analyze the markings, comparing them to historical symbols found in ritualistic practices. Some seemed to echo ancient sigils used for protection or binding, while others were more abstract, conveying messages to those who knew how to read them. The forest, it seemed, was layered with invisible communication, waiting for the initiated to understand. Investigators began documenting the messages, photographing and mapping their locations relative to the well. One pattern became particularly significant: several carvings pointed directly toward the well, as if guiding those who sought it, while others seemed to serve as warnings. A faint series of scratches on a fallen log spelled out, in crude lettering, "Do not follow the teeth." Another, carved into the stone at the edge of a clearing, read, "The forest remembers." The investigators realized they were piecing together a map of fear, ritual, and historical memory embedded in the terrain. Among the markings, there were also coded messages. Some appeared to be tally marks, counting in groups of 5, possibly recording the number of teeth or victims deposited in the well over time. Others were more complex, intertwining lines and symbols that suggested a form of encrypted communication. Experts theorized that the messages could have been intended for future participants, leaving instructions or historical records to ensure the continuation of rituals. The forest itself became a living ledger, chronicling decades of activity in a secret language. The investigators also discovered objects left deliberately near some of the markings, small trinkets, coins, and even teeth that had been deposited with care. These items were often fresh, indicating ongoing activity, and they served as both markers and messages. The presence of recent objects suggested that the perpetrators were aware of the investigation and were deliberately leaving signs, perhaps to mislead or intimidate. The forest was no longer passive, it had become interactive, a communication medium between the living, the missing, and the unseen custodians of the well. One particularly striking discovery was a series of messages carved into the roots of a massive oak near the well. The symbols were intricate, with interlocking shapes resembling both teeth and human figures. Beneath them, someone had placed a small bundle wrapped in cloth, containing what appeared to be old newspaper clippings of missing children, alongside several teeth. The investigators interpreted this as a historical record, a way for the cult to maintain continuity and memory over generations. The forest itself, in a way, was preserving the legacy of the well. Forensic analysis revealed additional layers of complexity. Some symbols were hidden beneath moss or lichen, requiring careful cleaning to uncover. Others were painted with natural pigments derived from plants, remaining visible only under certain light conditions. The messages were deliberate, sophisticated, and coded in ways that ensured only those with knowledge or training could interpret them. It became evident that the perpetrators had invested significant time and effort in creating a communication network that extended beyond mere ritual. It was a system designed to survive scrutiny. The investigators also began to consider the psychological implications. The messages were not just practical, they were tools of fear and control. They conveyed warnings, guidance, and subtle threats, shaping behavior and ensuring compliance among those who encountered them. The forest became an omnipresent authority, embedding instructions and intimidation into every surface. Even the investigators, trained and rational, felt the weight of these messages, a creeping sense that they were being observed and tested. Community knowledge played a crucial role in decoding some messages. Elders remembered patterns from their childhood, recalling how certain trees or rocks were marked with carvings that their parents had warned them never to touch. One resident, now elderly, admitted that she had been trained as a child to recognize symbols that indicated danger, teaching her which areas of the forest were forbidden. The investigators realized that local memory was not folklore alone, it was an encoded understanding, passed through generations, tied directly to the well and its rituals. The discovery of these hidden messages raised profound questions. Were the markings intended to guide future victims, instruct participants, or intimidate outsiders? Perhaps all three. Each message reinforced the notion that the well was not a static site but part of a living system, maintained and evolved over decades. Whoever controlled it was aware not only of the present but also of the past and future, shaping perception and action through carefully orchestrated symbols. Investigators began to cross-reference the markings with known cases of disappearance. They noticed that certain symbols appeared near the locations where missing persons were last seen or where evidence had been discovered. This alignment suggested that the markings were not random, they mapped a network of control and influence extending beyond the well. The forest itself acted as both a physical and psychological barrier, guiding participants and victims while obscuring outsiders' understanding. Psychologists studying the phenomenon noted that such hidden messages could have a profound effect on those who encountered them. Symbols, especially when associated with fear and ritual, can influence behavior in subtle but powerful ways. The markings in the forest were a tool for reinforcing obedience, ensuring secrecy, and perpetuating ritualistic practices across generations. The teeth in the well were tangible evidence, but the messages in the trees were the invisible framework that allowed the system to endure. Some messages were intended to provoke, as well. A recently carved symbol near the well depicted a small figure kneeling, surrounded by tiny impressions resembling teeth. Beneath it, the message read, "The Watchers see all." This direct warning indicated that the investigators themselves were under surveillance, that their actions were noted, and that the well's guardians remained vigilant. Fear was embedded not only in the threat of physical harm but in the psychological domination that the messages enforced. After weeks of painstaking investigation, the team stumbled upon the breakthrough they had been desperately seeking. Hidden deeper in the forest than any previous search had gone, behind a thicket of twisted trees and camouflaged undergrowth, they found a concealed path that led to a series of small clearings. Each clearing appeared meticulously arranged, with remnants of ritual activity similar to what they had already seen near the well. Broken twigs, small piles of stones, and faint traces of fire suggested ongoing use, but one particular clearing held a discovery that would change everything. At the center of this clearing was an older, stone-lined well, partially collapsed and covered with moss. Unlike the well they had first discovered, this one was smaller, older, and far more sinister in its arrangement. Around it were hundreds of small objects, teeth, bones, and personal effects carefully placed in deliberate order. The team realized that they had uncovered an original site, perhaps the precursor to the well that had become notorious in town history. This discovery confirmed that the ritualistic activity had deep roots, predating modern records, and that the current well was part of a larger system. Evidence suggested that the cult had operated in a network, moving between multiple wells and ritual sites. Each location held a specific purpose, from initiation to offering, to control. The layout of the clearings, aligned with symbols previously discovered, revealed an intentional design that mirrored ancient practices documented in historical accounts of ritual societies. Forensic analysis indicated that the teeth found here were older but had been preserved with care, some showing marks of cleaning and ceremonial handling, much like the modern deposits. The investigators realized the continuity of the practice was deliberate, sustained across generations with meticulous attention. A chilling piece of evidence was found near the edge of the clearing, a series of old photographs, yellowed with age, depicting groups of hooded figures performing rituals. Faces were obscured, but body language, positioning, and objects matched the patterns they had observed throughout the forest. Among the photographs was an image of a child holding a tin box similar to those described in decades-old disappearance reports, standing near a well eerily similar to the one they had just uncovered. The investigators recognized this as a visual record of participation, a form of historical documentation maintained by the cult itself. The team also discovered a series of journals, some handwritten and others typed, documenting instructions, rules, and observations. Pages detailed the selection of participants, methods for maintaining secrecy, and ritual procedures, including the collection of teeth and other personal effects. Some entries referenced historical disappearances, naming individuals with remarkable precision, while others provided guidance for conducting rituals in a way that would avoid detection. These journals provided not only evidence of past crimes but also insight into the mechanisms by which the cult maintained control over both participants and victims. Forensic analysis confirmed that the teeth in this secondary well matched patterns seen in the main well. DNA samples connected the teeth to previously unresolved disappearances, confirming the long-term scope of the cult's activity. Some teeth were decades old, while others were remarkably recent, indicating that the practice had persisted uninterrupted. The investigators now had irrefutable proof. The well was not a single site of horror but part of a coordinated, multi-generational operation designed to perpetuate fear, obedience, and ritualized sacrifice. The psychological impact of this discovery was profound. The team understood that the forest was not merely a passive location but an active participant in the orchestration of terror. Paths, symbols, wells, and markings were all deliberately designed to communicate, intimidate, and control. The investigators themselves had become part of this narrative, their presence noted, their movements tracked, and their reactions observed.